Fakhruddin al-Razi, in two major works from the middle or later period, namely his Nihayat al-Uqul and Matalib al-Aliyah. In these works, Razi argues that one aspect of a science's nobility is its object. I quote from him, "There is no doubt that he, the transcendent and exalted, is the most noble of known objects, Ashraf al-Ma'lumat, and therefore this science must be the noblest of sciences." Fakhruddin al-Razi mentions the threat of circularity when proving the principles of a science within that science. This certainly indicates that he would be fully aware of such a circularity resulting from when making God the subject matter of kalam or rational theology. So, al-Razi talks about the nobility of the science of rational theology, and he touches or indicates towards the threat of circularity when making God the subject matter of this science, but he does not go into full detail, or he does not fully delve into this kind of Avicennian discussion regarding the nature of Ilmul Kalam, of Islamic theology. Saif ad-Din al-Amidi, in his Ghayat al-Maram, Abkar al-Afkar, and Ihkam fi Usul al-Ahkam, in these works, for example, he makes explicit mention of this circularity problem, and furthermore his use of the term subject matter is rather broad and loose. Now this is the classical period. So towards the end of the classical period, we start to see some hints towards this kind of discussion of the issue of defining God as the subject matter of kalam, and hinting towards the need to sort of delve into this Avicennian definition of a science and its categorizations. But up until the early 7th and 13th centuries, there are rather loose descriptions of the science. These are not in Avicennian logic terms. Now, we must note that the kalam, the rational theology of the ancients, is distinguished from the kalam of the moderns by the latter's integration of Avicenna's philosophy into rational theology. This process began with Al-Ghazali, and it's very interesting because the reality is that Al-Ghazali used Avicennian philosophy to refute the Avicennian philosophers that he opposed. And in doing so, he in fact introduced many elements of Avicennian philosophy into the Kalami tradition, into the tradition of normative Sunni theology. And slowly but surely this started to build up, and eventually there came a point when Avicenna's philosophy was integrated into Kalam. Thus, Ibn Khaldun, the famous historian, made the point that it had become very difficult to distinguish between Kalam and Falsafa. And this was followed up by At-Taftazani, and he added more detail to the narrative. The transformation thus began with Ghazali, it expanded and developed with al-Razi, and like has been mentioned, this is due to the intensive engagement between the Islamic philosophy of the Mutakallimun, of the theologians, and the Islamized Neoplatonic philosophy of Ibn Sina. So, like has been mentioned, Al-Ghazali, had these very famous discussions, and he wrote these books refuting the philosophers. So for example, his engagement with the Avicennian tradition, and then Ibn Rushd's Averroes's refutations of him, and then this back and forth that occurred between the philosophers and the Mutakallimun, the theologians, this inevitably led to the integration of both sciences. So ironically, despite the fact that both these traditions were in conflict, inevitably these two traditions became integrated and assimilated with each other. These discussions between the Mutakallimun and the philosophers thus coincided and was accompanied by widespread adoption and development of Ibn Sina's logic by these theologians. And this includes detailed analysis of the structure of a science, as mentioned in Ibn Sina's Logic. Both traditions engaged each other so much that it became increasingly difficult to distinguish between them. This is also interesting because if we were to believe the Orientalist narrative regarding the Islamic intellectual tradition, the Islamic intellectual tradition supposedly underwent stagnation and decline after Al-Ghazali, and perhaps partially due to Al-Ghazali, as some Orientalists might assert. And this kind of idea of the decline thesis was very popular at one point in Orientalist circles. However, this is increasingly becoming a discredited theory and thesis for very good reasons, one of them being, like has been mentioned, the reality is that Al-Ghazali's engagement with the philosophers wasn't simply some conservative madman rambling on about the dangers of philosophy. Rather, Al-Ghazali's arguments were on a very rational philosophical basis, and he used rational and philosophical arguments to refute his opponents. That's how Al-Ghazali sought to, at least according to himself, refute those philosophers in the first place. And furthermore, it was due to Al-Ghazali that many elements of Avicennian philosophy became integrated with Kalam theology in the first place. Thus, elements of Ibn Sina's philosophy became more attractive to later mutakallimun or theologians, especially those who came after Fakhruddin al-Razi and Nasruddin al-Tusi. There were certainly elements that were problematic, at least from an orthodox Sunni normative perspective, and they remained so in latter periods, even where the study of his philosophy was widely cultivated. However, it's important to note that these problems that the theologians had with Ibn Sina, including the likes of Al-Ghazali and Al-Razi and those who came after them, were strictly theological issues. They were issues with some of the theological beliefs that Ibn Sina held. It wasn't to do with philosophy. It wasn't to do with his rational argumentation. It wasn't to do with the use of rationality. It was to do with certain beliefs that he held. And an important historical example to show this would be that many accepted at-Tusi's modification of Ibn Sina's general metaphysics. Thus, many theologians used Ibn Sina's metaphysics, indeed in a critical manner, but they certainly did employ it. Then comes the start of this conversation where the floodgates of this whole discussion are opened up. And this is done so by an important scholar, this being Siraj ad-Din al-Urmawi, who passed away in the year 682 of the Islamic calendar, or 1283 of the Gregorian calendar. The first point that should be noted about al-Urmawi is that he offers a resolution to the emergent demarcation problem, which was that how do we distinguish between Kalam, Islamic theology, and Avicenna's metaphysics, al-Ilm al-Ilahi. This is because one issue within the Islamic tradition at this time was the inability of many scholars, unfortunately, to not be able to distinguish between the normative description of metaphysics, the science of metaphysics in and of itself, which is not biased to any specific school of thought, which can be used as an intellectual tool for orthodox belief and against orthodox belief. So it's a neutral science like any other science in and of itself. And against the historical manifestation of the science in Avicenna's works, meaning how Ibn Sina and how Avicennians would have used that metaphysics to support their beliefs, many of which they might have considered as erroneous or heretical. Because in the same vein, Kalam itself, this kind of rational theology that the Muslims employed, is a kind of metaphysics, or at least it subsumes metaphysics into its philosophical project. Ad-Dawani later realized that the difference between the two was artificial. This resolution that Urmawi proposed allows for parallel continuation of both disciplines. There would be minimal, if any, conflict. once the boundaries of both sciences were set. And furthermore, thirdly and most importantly, it restricts the scope of both Avicennian metaphysics and of Kalam theology. This gave rise to this kind of critical metaphilosophy and this technical discussion on the subject matters of two respective sciences. However, it could be argued that this is based on false pretenses, as it falsely assumes that Kalam theology and Falsafa or Avicenna's divine science are two different sciences. Rather, they are different approaches within the same science. This may lead to a deeper problem, Urmawi's intervention, with Ibn Sina's theory of science, because it treats sciences as natural objects. Ibn Sina's theory of science, this leads to a deeper problem that it treats sciences as natural objects with proper parts, an essence and essential attributes. But the reality is that, as AbdurRahman Mihirig in his paper, which he discusses this, he mentions that sciences are objects of human acquisition. They proceed along human conventions. They proceed along sort of these human interests and these human conventions, and they serve the interests of the scientific or scholarly research community.